So we're leaving Kushadasi and...
Now,
oh, sorry, Alan.
in Turkey, after people are retired, they are paid, ladies and gentlemen, 70% of their last salary every 3 months as a pension.
Today we are heading for Konya via Pamukkale and firstly Aphrodisias. This is one of the many sites of archaeological and historical interest to be found in Anatolia. Now practically every time we stop for a rest and refreshment stop, we have the bus clean. Not sure whether that's part of the service or an optional extra. I should have asked Birol. We saw at Ephesus that the temple was a temple of Artemis, and that the cult of Artemis brought pilgrims, trade and wealth. In Aphrodisias, a similar situation existed, but the cult figure was Aphrodite, goddess of nature, beauty, love and plenty. Not dissimilar to Artemis, as far as I can see. Also, similarly, the site dates from the Neolithic age and had a goddess called Ishtar or Astarte, which on the arrival of the Greeks in the 10th century BC merged into the goddess Aphrodite. The name of the town then became Aphrodisias, a centre of pilgrimage to the cult figure of Aphrodite of Aphrodisias. Just take note of all the sculpture they've discovered here. We'll say more about that later. This map here will give you some idea of the layout of the site. This aerial view may or may not help, but this map here is brilliant. I just hope Planetware don't mind me borrowing it.
Pamukkale is the name of the formation. Hierapolis is the name of the ancient city.
Incidentally, this place had earlier been the capital of the province of Lydia. Remember those Lydians who took over Ephesus in 560 BC?
It's a wonderful day.
What we're gonna do first is walk up to the theatre. The theatre is built into the side of the hill on which the Acropolis stood. Before excavations began, as late as 1960s, this whole thing was filled with earth and had houses built on it. From up here we can get a fairly good view of the whole site, with the agora in the foreground. Aphrodisias was and is in a very fertile area, as I think is much of Anatolia. They had a flourishing wool and cotton industry. They developed commercial, political, religious and cultural institutions and arts and crafts. Now we'll take a walk over to Hadrian's Baths. As we move further northwards, we pass a complex which was a bishop's palace in Byzantine times and see something of the church which was fashioned out of the temple. And this brings us to the big stadium or amphitheatre at the northern end of the site, one of the biggest and best preserved anywhere. The town was located near a source of first-class marble. and one of its main claims to fame was the School of Sculpture which developed there. In its heyday, sculptures were exported throughout the Roman world. Later, as at Ephesus, Christianity became the religion and took over from the Aphrodite cult. Here, however, the temple was converted into a church. In the early 600s, there were raids and incursions from Arab invaders. Then there were several epidemics which caused great loss of life. And later in that century, the whole place was flattened by a massive earthquake. Now, while we're making our way to Pamukkale, let's say a bit more about Aphrodisias, mainly about the discovery and excavation of the site. I've no doubt that the local inhabitants always knew that there were some ruins here. Indeed, as we mentioned, some had built their houses on top of them, but the world wasn't interested. It is surprisingly recently that the world, even scholars, were interested at all in such matters. Was it sometime in the 15th or 16th century that we started to think about classical times during what we call the Renaissance? Then in 1740, an Englishman called Richard Pocock saw the site and wrote down a description of it. In 1835, 100 years later, a chap called Charles Texier visited. But in 1892, Osman Hamdi Bey, the director of the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, which we'll see later, paid a visit and decided on excavations. But still nothing happened. However, between 1904 and 1913, two French archaeologists, Gaudin and Mendel, did some excavations, and in 1937 an Italian called Jacobi did some more. Well, as you can see, we've now arrived at Pamukkale, which means Cotton Castle. So while you have a look round and see what you can do here, I'll finish off this story. In 1956, an earthquake destroyed most of the village which had come into existence on the site, and the authorities took the opportunity to refound the village nearby and fence off the site. 2 years later, a well-known photographer called Ara Gula saw the site quite by chance whilst on a visit locally. He took some pictures for a magazine, which then asked him for some explanatory text. The Istanbul Museum referred him to a professor at the University of New York. This man was Kenan Erim, an American of Turkish origin who had always wanted to visit Aphrodisias. Erim visited in 1959 and in 1961 embarked on a program of excavation which occupied him for the rest of his life. So yes, as you've seen, there are some interesting formations here in Pamukkale caused by the hot springs trickling down the hill and depositing limestone. But adjacent here is the town of Hierapolis. I'm sorry I've no film, I only just made it back to the bus from here, but I've pinched a couple of pictures off the internet to give an idea of the place. And down below is a modern health resort dependent on the hot springs, at whose hotel we stayed the night. Come on now, you must keep up. It's next morning and we're off to Konya. I'm told that Konya, or whatever they called it in those days, was the first town to emerge after the flood. There was a prehistoric settlement here, as no doubt there were in a lot of places. Then there was a Hittite settlement, and later a Phrygian town. Then things seem to have gone quiet for a few thousand years, though we know the Romans knew it as Iconium. We're entering Konya now, and as you will no doubt gather, it's expanded a lot since those days. Its next important date seems to be in the 12th century, when it became the capital of the Seljuk Turks. These were illegal immigrants coming from the steppes of Central Asia, the precursors of several waves of Turkic people coming this way, later ones being the Osmanli Turks. Our hotel in Konya is downtown, just opposite the big mosque. There are several interesting buildings, including mosques built from Seljuk times onwards, one built in the 19th century, described as a Baroque mosque, none of which we see, but think on this as a very quick tour around Turkey, and Konya is just an overnight stop. But we were able to see perhaps the most important building in Konya, which attracts pilgrims from all over the place, the Mevlana Museum. It's just over the road next to that big mosque. The site is the resting place of the founder of the Islamic sect that we call the Whirling Dervishes. Though technically now a museum, it is a holy place to those many pilgrims. Under the Seljuk Sultans in the 12th and 13th centuries, Konya became a refuge for artists and men of learning from all over the Middle East. This Mevlana, who founded this sect, was one of these. When we hear of dervishes, I think we tend to think, or at least I do, of those dervishes in the Sudan who attacked and killed General Gordon. People who we may think of as a bit demented and definitely aggressive. On the contrary, Mevlana formed this mystic sect, believing that slavery was wrong and advocated monogamy. The teachings of the sect also include religious tolerance, the brotherhood of all men before God, gentleness, humility and charity. Mevlana also advocated equal status for women. The whirling dance, with its special accompanying music, is a channel of spiritual communion with God. I liked Konya. It seemed to me to be a nice, tidy town, going about its own business in a civilized manner. I suppose I could have spent the short time we had here trailing down to see those interesting buildings I mentioned earlier. But now I'm glad that I spent the time mingling as much as one can with a loaded camcorder, mingling with the day-to-day life and doing some window shopping. Now look, we're nearly back at the mosque and the hotel, and we've an early start tomorrow for Cappadocia.